Another reason why I left church, religion, Christianity, and fundamentalism is that the church doesn't support critical race theory. So, for those who may not have been in school during the time the term was coined, critical race theory or CRT, or perhaps you grew up in a state where it was not taught due to laws and legislations by hate groups, let's talk about what critical race theory is, and then we'll move into why extreme fundamentalists and high control parts of Christianity wouldn't support it. So critical race theory, also known as CRT, is an academic and legal framework that examines how race and racism have shaped and continue to influence laws, social structures, and institutions in the U.S. It argues that racism is not simply an individual prejudice or bias, but is a systematic issue embedded within society's fabric, affecting areas like education, housing, employment, and healthcare. CRT recognizes that despite advancements like the civil rights movement, racial inequalities persist and can be traced back to laws and policies that, even if seemingly racial neutral, perpetuate racial disparities. And you can look this up on the Legal Defense Fund website. So what are some key concepts? 1. Race as a social construct. CRT views race as a social construct created by society rather than a biologic reality. 2. Systematic nature of racism. CRT emphasizes that racism is ingrained in institutions and systems rather than solely individual acts of discrimination. 3. Critique of liberalism. CRT scholars often question the effectiveness of colorblind approaches, arguing that ignoring race allows existing inequalities to persist. 4. Intersectionality, a key concept in CRT. Intersectionality analyzes how various forms of inequality, such as race, class, gender, and disability, intersect and create unique experiences of oppression. You can Google this on Wikipedia if you have further interest in intersectionality. 5. Interest convergence. This tenet suggests that white individuals will support racial equity initiatives only when those initiatives align with their own interests. So in layman's terms, people who have white privilege will only support non-white people when it doesn't interfere, impact, or reduce their privilege. 6. Storytelling and counter-storytelling. CRT uses narratives and personal experiences to challenge dominant narratives and highlight marginalized voices. Lastly, importance of experiential knowledge. CRT values and incorporates lived experiences and perceptions of people of color in its analysis. So what about the origin and development? Where did CRT even come from? CRT emerged from the civil rights movement and the critical legal studies movement in the 70s and 80s, primarily within legal scholarship. Scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw are credited with developing the framework of CRT. CRT later expanded beyond legal studies into other fields, including education, sociology, and ethnic studies. So how does CRT get implemented into schools, colleges, and any educational or lawmaking practices? CRT is used to examine and challenge various aspects of society, including the law, analyzing how legal systems contribute and maintain racial inequity due to legislation and existing or upcoming laws. Education, examining curriculum, policies, and practices that perpetuate racial disparities in schools and stereotypes. You can look this up on the Oxford Research Encyclopedia if you have any other, if you have curiosity or want to know a little bit more about it. Social structures, understanding how race shapes various social practices and institutions. So let's get into the criticisms of CRT, because anything that takes the focus off white privilege and focuses it on some minority or some group that doesn't advance or perpetuate white privilege stereotypes, how do these people criticize it? Misinterpretation and polarization. Critics argue that CRT has been misinterpreted and used inappropriately for political ends, according to Temple University. Divisiveness. Some argue that CRT promotes division by focusing on group identity and perceived oppression. Focus on systematic factors. Critics suggest that CRT may overly emphasize systematic factors and overlook individual responsibility. Guilt and blame. Concerns have been raised that CRT can lead to white children feeling guilt or fear. It's important to note that the term critical race theory is frequently debated and misunderstood, with various interpretations and perspectives surrounding its meaning and application. So, why do people seem to take offense to CRT? Well, the most common reason is because it affects white privilege. It challenges our narrowed view of social, economical, and racial issues. It requires accountability. People who are from privileged races have to be presented and acknowledge accountability and self-reflection to see if they're continuing and championing and supporting things that perpetuate critical race theory ideology, which means, are you supporting any groups, legislation, or ideas or religions that systematically approve of the oppression and subjugation of non-white races? So, CRT has been used in sociology to explain social, political, and legal structures and power distribution. We call CRT a lens that focuses on the concept of race and experiences of racism. Recently, I was in downtown LA and had the privilege of going into the Broad Museum. It's a very interesting art museum. There are different floors, but if you ever are in LA and want to see it, when I went there a few months ago, they were focusing on art that has to do with African American history, civil rights, and the oppression of African American people. And it showed slavery, civil rights, the Prohibition era, modern paintings. It did show a lot of the ways that the African Americans have progressed toward more accepted, at least socially accepted equality. There are still a lot of laws on the books, even if they're not being enforced, that show that African American people are being oppressed. And CRT began in the United States post-civil rights era, so anywhere after the 1960s. This occurred because landmark civil rights laws were being eroded and schools were being resegregated. With racial inequalities persisting even after civil rights legislation and colorblind laws, CRT scholars in the 70s and 80s began reworking and expanding critical legal studies. And if you want to learn who most of these advocates for CRT are, just do a simple Google search or go on Wikipedia. There are so many interesting names on this list. Academic critics of CRT seem to focus on storytelling instead of evidence and reason, rejecting truth and merit and undervaluing liberalism. Since 2020, conservative U.S. lawmakers, backed by corporate and the large denominations of Christianity, have sought to ban or restrict the teaching of CRT in primary and secondary schools, as well as relevant training inside federal agencies. Advocates of such bans argue that that CRT is false, anti-American, villainizes white people, promotes racial leftism, and indoctrinates children. That makes me laugh. Advocates of bans on CRT have been accused of misrepresenting its tenets and of having the goal to broadly silence discussions of racism, equality, social justice, and the history of race. Well, they're not wrong. Now, there are a lot of people that oppose critical race theory being taught in schools who don't have the insidious agenda of silencing people of color, minorities, gay people. They just were born or raised in an environment where they believe that anything that shakes the status quo is something that's trying to lure kids away into something that isn't un-American. I grew up in one of these environments. Yes, I did learn a little bit about racism, civil rights movement, colonialization, Native American displacement, but it was never a condemnation unless it had to do in the 1950s and 60s. There was never a condemnation of this behavior. We never did in-depth research or education into how these events affected anybody except white people, or sometimes they focused on how it affected slaves after they were free. And there is a misconception that once the slaves were free, they got the right to vote and had happy lives. Even in the 1960s, I think it was 1968, where African American or people of color finally received the right to vote, almost a half century after women received the right to vote. Even then, a lot of African American people couldn't vote due to laws or discrimination. And it's still going on today. I mean, if you do a simple Google search on the police brutality, how many people the police have killed, how many officers in various police forces have gotten away with intentional, premeditated, or intentional death after the fact. George Floyd, 5 years ago, the Trump administration is still using that footage to create fear in LA in 2025, saying that there's violent protests. The problem with squelching talk about systematic racism, it's all about preserving white privilege. Now that we've talked about how CRT is debated and criticized in the secular communities, let's talk about how it affects inside churches, church families, and how that affects kids who go out into the secular school system. Growing up in Southern Baptist fundamentalist Christianity, I experienced a lot of racism, and I've touched on this in the last few videos. Anytime a person who wasn't white was shown on a poster, an event flyer, an activity for kids, they always showed either a white person wearing a traditional Asian, African, or European garb, or it was an actual Asian, but they were wearing a kimono. Because when you grow up in extremely white supremacist environments, where I was not lucky enough to see more than 3 people in my childhood, in 25 years in church, not even 3 people were not white. And this was more in the Southern Baptist Calvinistic churches. But I have never seen a person of color in a position of authority, junior or senior leadership, in any church, in 4 denominations. when anytime somebody who isn't white is portrayed